Welcome to Data Skeptic, a podcast exploring the methods, use cases, and consequences of recommender systems. Welcome to another installment of Data Skeptic Recommender Systems. Today on the show we take on the topic of news recommendations. Now at a glance, this could seem like the type of problem where you could quickly adapt existing techniques to use. Why can't you recommend news with the same methodology as you use for recommending movies? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. Obviously, movies can be more evergreen, whereas news stories are pretty timely, but also you get different feedback. I'm happy to give thumbs up to a movie I like. I'm not going to thumbs up an article that's well written about how innocent people died. Those differences aside, the stakes are pretty high here. If you recommend the wrong movie, at worst you've wasted a person's time. If you consistently recommend the wrong news stories, you could introduce bias, or put a person inside of a bubble. The information highway has brought us a deluge of information, more than any one person could consume in a day. So news recommendation systems are becoming more important than ever, and we'll be exploring that topic in today's interview.
Hello, my name is Andreea Iana. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in the Data and Web Science group of the University of Mannheim. I am interested in working on responsible and inclusive AI for information access, and I have recently finished my PhD where I focused on neural news recommendation.
Very cool. Before we get into news recommendations, could you expand a little bit on responsible and inclusive AI? What does that mean to you?
So let me maybe start with the news recommendation domain where I focused on this topic. So here I try to look at the problem from three different angles. To take a step back, when most people think of recommender systems, they think about, products or music or movies. But a very important domain is actually the news domain, because nowadays a lot of the platforms that we are using to access information have some recommender system running in the background that filters the information that we are trying to access and personalizes it to our taste. So in a way, recommender systems influence the information that we're exposed to, and basically they can shape our view of the world because of the information that we can actually get access to. And especially this is very important since news are a pillar of democratic societies, and by filtering some of the information that is not deemed relevant to our taste or our preferences, we might not be exposed to all sides of a debate, for example. And this has been shown that it can create so-called filter bubbles. So basically an environment where people are exposed only to information that agrees to their own opinions or to their own views of the world. And this can, in the long term, lead to things like opinion polarization or radicalization. So in this area, what I understand by responsible and inclusive AI is basically AI or systems that do not only care about performance, for example, increasing click-through rate on a website or on certain news, but also systems that care more about the broader societal values, such as diversity of opinions, inclusion of different users. For example, something that I focused a lot in my PhD was studying whether different biases occur in recommender systems, or whether recommender systems tend to, for example, prefer certain types of viewpoints or sentiments of news articles, whether these follow, for example, user preferences or even amplify these, and how we can actually try to mitigate these effects, and also how we can be more inclusive in terms of linguistic inclusivity, because, for example, I speak multiple languages, and a lot of people in the world are polyglots, and they consume news in multiple languages, and some of these languages are not so high resource, so they don't have a very high digital footprint like English, and we've seen over the years that systems don't perform so well in languages that are not English or that are further away linguistically from English. So how can we actually create systems that would also support speakers that speak less represented languages or that want to consume news in parallel in multiple languages?
Do you think it could be the case that AI will just solve that for us? It does seem to be pretty good at languages. I agree, maybe English primarily, since that's most of the training data. But do we just need more time and it'll learn all the languages, or do you think special care is in order?
I mean, over the years, it got a lot better at other languages, but I would say we're still quite far away from representing all the languages. And right now, existing models, so everyone talks about large language models, only support a couple of tens or maybe hundreds of languages, but we have over 7,000 languages in the world. And some of these are not even represented via text, so they are mostly spoken, which means that we don't even really have training data to include them, to train AI models for them. So I think we're still quite far away from that. Of course, we are closing the gap, but only for certain languages. And as I've seen in my own work, if you target a language that is quite dissimilar from English or some other Western languages, the performance of any model drops tremendously.
Did you take an interest in recommender systems and then find news as a particularly novel outcome, or were you interested in news and found your way to recommender systems?
To be honest, I started with recommender systems, and this is a bit of an older story. So I had my first encounter with recommender systems at the end of my bachelor, where I worked a bit on a recommender system for basically recommending courses to students based on which courses they've already taken and how they want to build the curriculum. And then later on during the master's, I went a bit more into scientific recommender systems. So for example, where should I publish a paper that I've just written at which venue, which academic conference is most relevant for me. And then when I decided to do a PhD, it was a mixture of everything. So I had this hate-love relationship with recommender systems. I liked them, but I didn't like that they narrow our perspectives on what we're seeing everywhere. And there was a project that was looking exactly at responsible recommender systems in the news domain. So this is how I came across this, and I got very interested in this because the news domain itself is quite special. So it shares a lot of similarities with, again, a product or music recommendation, but what makes it special is that it's very societally relevant, and not only that, but also the characteristics of the news that we're seeing. So we have thousands of news published every day, whose relevance decays extremely rapidly. So while a movie can still be relevant in 20 years, a lot of the news that we see today might not be even important tomorrow or in a few days. So we have this extremely high churn of news. Also, for example, user feedback is not explicit. So we only know that, okay, the user clicked on a particular article, but what does this actually say? Was the user just interested or in that article, or just clicked on it and then closed it, and so on and so forth. So that's how I started on this.
You hit on a very interesting point there. When it comes to product reviews, music, books, movies, whatever, we're thinking of rating it 5 stars or thumbs up, thumbs down. I don't think I've ever rated a news article. How do you get feedback?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, feedback is mostly implicit. So what we take as a proxy for the user feedback is usually clicks. And then there's a couple of other signals that there can be, for example, the time spent on an article. If it's very short, a couple of seconds, we probably can consider that the user clicked on it, but was not interested. Yeah, that's mostly implicit feedback in terms of clicks. The time spent from the user side, I would say, because there's also a lot of maybe demographic information that you would have for other domains that you don't have for the news system. And again, for the news domain, a lot of these interactions are limited to a single session, because at least when we work with academic data sets, we know that, so maybe to take a step back here, since the user is not logged in a lot of these platforms, we cannot track the user's clicks across very long sessions. So we have very short time spans in which we know, okay, the user clicked on these 30 news, compared to, for example, movie recommendation, where we can follow the user on a certain platform across the years, and we have a very long user history from which we can learn the preferences.
Well, I have some questions I'd like to deep dive into on NewsRecLib, but I guess before we go too deep, could you just define what this library is? What is the project you worked on? What is its function?
Yeah, sure. So in the beginning of my work in news recommendation, a problem I really encountered was that we have a lot of different systems that are implemented in different ways on different platforms using different libraries and capabilities. And I found it quite hard to compare meaningfully and to compare apples to apples sometimes, because we look at a paper, we see some numbers reported from some models that claim to be better than other recommender systems, and there's a lot of moving parts. One problem is that everyone implements their own system, and what I try to do with NewsRecLib is put all the system in one place, and in a way such that we can we can decouple most of the building blocks of the recommender system and keep whatever we want to keep fixed, such that we can see which parts of the model have the highest impact on performance, and so on and so forth. So, for example, what you can do in NewsRecLib is combine different modules from different models. So let's say we take the part that is responsible for creating a representation of the news from one model, and we couple it together with the part that creates sort of representation of the user profile in another model, and we can just mix and match everything. And the idea is to create a platform where we can have a very rigorous evaluation of different models on different data sets, and everything is highly reproducible.
Well, there's a common example of e-commerce where historically, I guess you'd have handcrafted features. Anymore, it's probably an embedding of some kind. You embed the product and you embed the user too, based on what you know about their preferences. Is this a pretty direct analog, or have you had to model the problem of news in a different way?
I would say it's quite similar, apart from since I looked at neural news recommendation, we don't use handcrafted features, but what we do is let a neural network create these representations of news and users. So to briefly say how a neural news recommender looks like, it has a couple of building blocks. One of them is a news encoder that takes an article, for example, the title of an article or the headline, or maybe some other features like the category or the viewpoint, and creates a representation of that article, a numerical representation that can be used by the model afterwards. And then we have the user encoder that aggregates the representations of the news that the user has clicked on into a user representation, which is meant to capture preferences of the user, based on what they have clicked on. Again, we take that as a proxy for what we think the user is interested in. And then for each candidate article that we have in our large news pool, we try to see if it would be relevant for the user based on this user profile. So from that point of view, I would say, yes, this matches. And the idea is, okay, how do we construct the user encoder? How do we construct the news encoder? And then based on how we select these different building blocks, how we can create the overall architecture. So NewsRecLib has some predefined models that were state-of-the-art at the time when I created it. But of course, any new model can be added to the library, for example, just by specifying a new type of news encoder or user encoder. Or you can, as I mentioned already, take different building blocks that are already implemented and just mix and match them.
So would you describe NewsRecLib as like a framework in that regard, that I could bring my own model?
Yes, exactly. Something like that. And then you can just, as I said, build your own building blocks there and then just test it on existing data sets. Or if you have a new data set, for example, also include it in the framework such that new models from other developers could be tested on it.
Are there common data sets that you would recommend to listeners if they were embarking on the similar path?
Yeah, sure. So one of the very used data sets was the Microsoft News Recommender data set, but this has now got quite a bit old. A newer data set that has been published, I think, 2 years ago, it's Ebnerd from a Danish news media company. And there's a couple of other smaller ones. But in general, one big problem, I guess, for the news domain is that a lot of these data sets, so the media companies that have this data don't really make open source these data sets. So we are working with just a couple of data sets that over time, of course, also get a bit outdated and also very highly differing the sort of articles they actually contain. So, for example, the Mind data set has a lot of what we call soft news, so a lot of entertainment news or sports, while Ebnerd has a lot more of hard news that contain more politics or more sensitive topics.
What was your original motivation for starting the NewsRecLib project?
In a nutshell, I had to work with a lot of different models, and I got a bit frustrated at the lack of comparability and how hard it is to get everything to work. So I thought, okay, it's easier to spend all the time to put everything in one place, and then it's a lot easier to just incrementally make new changes or bring in a new model. And this is especially useful when you want to have reproducible evaluations and reproducible work, because everything is built on the same, let's say, underlining framework.
Well, there's definitely a perspective in this day and age that maybe bigger is better when it comes to models. Let me take the one that has the most parameters, and I'll just assume that's the best for me. What's your perspective on it?
Yeah, I really think it depends on what we're looking at. And as I've seen in my work, this is not always the case. So I also started with this assumption that more complex architecture actually bring in more performance and better performance. But one thing that I came across during my work and then continued investigating that was quite surprising is that, as I've said, this is not always the case. So what we've discovered is that sometimes simpler is better. And here I refer mostly to the user side. So in our peeling back the layers, what we actually tried to do was to decompose the building blocks of the recommender system and try to understand what exactly drives performance. And this is because over the years, every new system that was being proposed was more complex or introduced some tiny change compared to an existing model, and then reported maybe a couple of percentages improvement or even less than a percentage improvement over existing systems. So it was very hard to judge, okay, do these more complex or incremental changes actually bring anything meaningful? And what we try to do is, first of all, decompose as much as possible these different components, the news encoder, the user encoder, how we combine everything, and try to keep fixed as many parts as possible and just move one at a time to see, okay, what is the impact of this part on the performance of the system? And here we didn't look only at performance in terms of what is usually measured in offline evaluations. So, for example, how good is the model at ranking the relevant candidate articles? But we also wanted to understand, hey, do these two different models actually recommend the same thing or not? And do they actually create very similar representations of news and users or not? And what we actually found is that what really drives performance in terms of ranking, similarity, and everything in our setup is the news encoder. So what matters very much is how good are the representations of the articles that we are creating. And here, of course, I would say maybe a bit the bigger is better, because indeed, if we use, for example, pre-trained language models, so language models that were trained on vast amount of data, usually sourced from the internet, already know how to capture a lot of intrinsic knowledge from the news articles, how to capture, for example, topics from the text itself. So here, yes, bigger is better, but at the same time, we've noticed that on the user modeling part, bigger is not better. So there we actually had a very surprising result that more or less just taking the representation of the articles that the user clicked and just averaging these representations performs equally better to a lot more complex approaches. And why we think that's the case is because, as I've mentioned before, news recommendation is very different than other domains where we have very long histories. So on the one hand, on such short histories, maybe we cannot capture some sequential signals that we would capture, for example, in e-commerce or music or movies. And on the other side, again, such powerful language models already capture all the needed knowledge from the text itself. So here, at least in my work, I mostly looked at content-based news recommenders. So this means that we looked at systems that we cared mostly about the content of the articles, and this is text. And again, this is different to maybe music recommendation, where you care also about the audio part of a song. By keeping all these parts fixed and then just varying, for example, we keep the news encoder fixed and vary the different user encoder approaches that we've seen out there. We saw that, okay, what really drives performance is the underlying news encoder. And again, not only in terms of ranking performance, but what we found quite surprising is also in terms of the similarity of the recommendations that they produce. So, for example, if we take list of recommendations of 10, we found out that in 70% of the cases, no matter how different the user encoders are, we have the same set of recommendations. So in practice, we maybe see a difference of 0.5 improvement in ranking, but what does this actually mean when we look at what's recommended? And there's not much difference. And I think this is very important in practice, because what it tells us is that we don't need to invest time so much into making incrementally more complex changes, but maybe taking what's out there, understanding what really drives performance, and then using some simpler approaches.
I think I'm correct in characterizing it then, saying that the news encoder is where you found the most performant qualities. And I want to drill down there, but before we jump into it, when you think about the user encoding, do you think the reason that there's no more juice for the squeeze is because the methodologies are, perfectly state of the art and great, or is there something lacking maybe in how the solicitation of feedback, that is just not a rich enough environment? What's your perspective on why the user encoding is kind of maxed out?
Mostly the second one, I think. So because in the first one, I'm not sure if we showed that just taking the average of the representations of the news that the user consumed is performing on par with very complex approaches. So maybe it's not that we already have the state of the art there. I think it mostly comes from the signals that we have from the user himself. And this comes a lot to the data that we have. In particular, again, we only have clicks, and we assume that the few clicks that we have, the articles that the user clicked on, mean that the person is interested in that article. And we know this can also be, for example, a lot of clickbait, or sometimes just randomly clicking on an article and closing it, especially that a big problem with data sets in academia is that we don't have signals such as dwell time all the time. So we don't all the time have information about the dwell time. So how much time did the user actually spend on certain article to actually say, okay, they clicked and spent time on it, so then it must have been really important to them. So I think generally, yes, having richer signals and richer data would probably go a long way to actually seeing where this user modeling helps, because I believe that user modeling or user encoders are still important, but with the data that we have and with the way we're modeling the news also, we can't go much further than this. So we would actually need richer data sets and more up-to-date data sets.
Well, I hope somehow they exist one day. That'd be a nice thing to come into being. But in the meantime, if we focus then on the news encoding, if chasing complexity doesn't necessarily pay off, bigger's not always better, do you have any insights as to what does make one news encoding better than another?
So a lot of the neural news recommenders in the beginning used what was called pre-trained word embeddings. So again, before the large language models, there were the word embeddings that creating a static representation of some words. And there were a lot of problems there because, for example, if you would have two words, classic example, the bank where we get the money from, or the bank of the river, or the bank in the park would get the same representation. So the context was not captured by this. And what was happening in the first iteration of neural news recommenders is that we were adding some neural networks on top of these pre-trained word embeddings to try to contextualize the meaning of this. And here we've seen that, for example, just looking at the text of an article produced decent representations of the news, but in that case, adding more information, for example, about the category of an article, or some of the entities that were contained in the article. So this means names of organizations or people or locations, added a lot more to the quality of the embeddings. Of course, when the language models got a lot better, so they got to be contextualized during pre-training, trained on the whole web corpora and so on and so forth, adding these extra signals, the benefits you would get from adding these extra signals from categories or from entities started to decrease. And we've seen that, here, the bigger, the better in terms of the language model. But even here, for example, we can get very good representations with some smaller language models. So we don't need to go with the latest embeddings that the biggest LLM can produce nowadays.
Well, when comparing two different models, hopefully on the same data set, it all comes down to some benchmark. Do you think as a community we have the right benchmarks today?
I would say no. And again, this is because most of the open source benchmarks that are out there, so the ones publicly available, are a few years old. So even the EBNerd is 2 years old, I think, by now. And yeah, as I said, the news domain is fast moving and changing, and keeping up to date with that would be very important. And not only that, but most of these benchmarks focus only on the textual content of news. And I think this is not the only thing that matters, especially in today's world. Images, so multimodal inputs such as images or videos, play a very big role, because sometimes maybe people are triggered to click on a certain article because of the image that is attached to that article and not just because of the title. A lot of news consumption has now changed. A lot of people consume news also via short videos or other means, so not only textual news articles, and these are not captured yet in the existing benchmarks that we have. So as a community, I would think maybe higher or a bigger collaboration between industry that has access to this sort of data and academia that works on a lot of methods on how to improve news recommendation, and not only in terms of performance, but again, if we go back to other things like responsibility and inclusivity, this would go a long way to have fresher, more up-to-date and richer data sets.
Would you mind commenting a bit on your thoughts on filter bubbles and the role recommender system plays in promoting them or getting rid of them, or how do recommender systems cozy up to the problem of filter bubbles?
Yeah, sure. So in a nutshell, what happens with recommender systems is that they are usually optimized to maximize the user engagement with something. For example, for click-through rate, so we want the user to click more on certain articles. And to achieve this engagement, what they are usually trying to do is to maximize the relevance or the similarity of what's recommended to what the user has already consumed, because then we know for sure, okay, this article will be interesting to the user. And this is what usually creates this feedback loop in which the user consumes some news, let's say some right-wing politics news, and then the recommender knows, okay, the user likes right-wing politics, so I will just keep recommending right-wing politics. And the problem is then that the user doesn't really see articles from a different viewpoint or perspective, or maybe from other categories. And here the evidence, it's a bit mixed whether these filter bubbles are real or not, depending on the studies that have been done. But what we've also noticed in our own work is that recommenders do have a tendency to recommend slightly more negatively framed or negative viewpoints on articles that go beyond what's already in the data. So we already know that a lot of, for example, politics news have a negative sentiment, but what we've observed is that the news recommenders tend to still recommend even more negatively framed articles. So the problem is that then you're only exposed to what you agree with, and this really can generally influence a person's perspective, viewpoint, and opinion in general. So this is why I'm saying that not only performance matters, especially in the news domain, but also taking into account these effects of recommender systems, these societal effects, and what we should strive for is balancing accuracy and performance in general with more balance in what we recommend, more diversity, and so on.
Curious if you have any thoughts on how to optimize that. It does seem that diversity of viewpoints is a good thing, but somewhere someone probably assumes the Artemis mission was filmed on a soundstage and the moon landing was faked, and I don't think we need to necessarily promote that diversity of opinion. How do we optimize for this?
Yes, I would say that diversity should be real diversity or real balance when we try to achieve it, and not just pretend. So we shouldn't recommend, let's say, articles from all the sides of the scientific or political spectrum for the sake of saying that something is balanced, but it should also be recommended proportionally to the evidence. So of course, if something is just conspiracy theory, we shouldn't promote it as highly as we would promote something that is scientifically backed. How to achieve this? Yeah, that's a more complex question. So on the one hand, we should not only optimize for accuracy, which is what happens in a lot of the systems now, and then optimizing for something like perspective diversity or category diversity is already a goal that it's optimizing for accuracy and optimizing for diversity are conflicting goals. So we have to find a balance between that. And then how to find the right balance, I think it should be not only something done by the system, but it should be something that takes into account multiple stakeholders here, because we have the writers of the articles, we have the editors, we have the users themselves, we have maybe the more societal related goals. So as a society, we do not want to promote fake news, for example. We don't want to promote, I don't know, conspiracy theories, or also not sensational news. Those would maximize, for example, the click-through rate, but it's not something that we would like users to always click on. So in general, I think to achieve a true balance, we should have multi-stakeholder recommender systems that try to balance the interests of all these stakeholders, which again goes into different and even more complex problem, how to balance this, not only perspectives, but how to balance multiple stakeholders. But in general, yeah, we should take a step back from just driving performance to try to include a bit of diversity. And how to do this, I would say, again, should be a mixture of maybe, let's call it, some default values. So if we would have a system on a website that allows users to, let's say, turn the knob, I want more diversity with respect to category, or I want more diversity with respect to the perspectives that I'm seeing, there should still be some hard-coded or default values that don't allow people to go beyond something that is reasonable in a society. So yeah, again, you can say, okay, I want more diversity and I want to see this point of view from the left and the right wing side, but it shouldn't allow people to just read conspiracy theories, for example.
Yeah. Well, when I go to one of these streaming video sites to find a TV show or a movie, it's pretty clear to me they're doing some recommendation. It's a little bit personalized to me, especially if I've been there before. I'm not certain if I'm encountering news recommendations in my daily life. If I just go to a news website, maybe everyone sees the same, just like the old printed out days or whatnot. Where do the typical people encounter news recommendations in their life today?
Yeah, so I would say maybe if you go to the platform of a specific news magazine, for example, you maybe don't see it so much, but especially on aggregator platforms. So Google News, for example, if you go to Google News and you click on a couple of news and then you close it down and then you go back, at least I keep seeing more or less news coming from the same category or topic. So for example, I attended a half marathon in a city and now I keep getting news about that city itself, or half marathons around the world, or so on and so forth. So I would say in these sort of places, and I would say it's also a lot of how people consume news nowadays. So we have seen in the past that consumption has really changed from going to a specific website of one publisher to going to these news aggregators and just looking for a specific topic or a specific event that happened in the world, and then getting news that are aggregated there from different publishers. And this is really where recommendation and personalization comes in.
A lot of your work has, maybe I could characterize it as saying that there's a complexity for its own sake is not the virtue, that probably at the direct fault of the machine learning community, we've pushed our methodologies and that's worked in a lot of fields and brought us large language models and things like that. But more is not always better, I guess, at least in news. So what is better? Where would you like to see the field focusing its efforts?
I would say, on the one hand, just like any field, I think we should, from time to time, take a step back and have a really good look at what we're trying to achieve, what we have achieved, and really if we made any progress. Because as I've seen in my own work, and as we've seen in the broader area of recommender systems, also in other fields, sometimes we push for a lot of complexity or newer models, but then it turns out that comparing apples to apples in a fair setup, actually older and simpler methodologies win. But apart from that, I would say, yeah, not caring just about performance and looking now, okay, the systems are already performing very well for English speakers, for recommending exactly what you would like to see, but how about other things? So how about if I want to see actually not all the time the same thing? What if I like a bit of serendipity, and what if I like to see multiple perspectives on something? Or especially what it's very interesting, what if I want to read news in multiple languages. And here I don't want to read the same news in two languages. Maybe I want to read about international news in English, and then I want to read about local events in German since I live in Germany. And how do we make systems that actually support this kind of thing such that I don't have to go to different platforms and search for these things myself and then sort of aggregate, so I don't have to switch between platforms myself, but I would just go to one place and I would get all this news in the languages that I want to speak. And again, I speak very well represented languages, but what if someone wants to have access to information and they only speak Georgian, for example, and we know that Georgian is not so well represented, so then do they actually have to turn to English to benefit from this personalized news recommendation, or do they have to rely on machine translation, which again is not very good because it doesn't perform so well on Georgian, and so on and so forth. So I think we should not only focus on performance, but also on a lot of other things that are important for us as a society and also for different users, such that not only Western-centric content is well represented, but that we can generally serve users across the world more equitably.
Yeah, I think if there was, let's say, something going on in another part of the world, maybe a conflict, and I wanted to understand it better, ideally, I would hear it from the actual affected people in their native words, which as only an English speaker, I can't quite do that. So I guess I would go for translation in that case. Do you think we'll get translation close enough at some point, or will this always pose a challenge that there's no true translation?
I think we're getting translation better and better, but we're still not at perfect translation. So nowadays I'm working also on a data set for something not related to news, and working with different languages, we can really see how translation degrades when we go further away from English, and especially if you have some terminology or domain-specific terms, especially if these don't maybe have a counterpart in English. And a lot of things that are missed in machine translation is generally maybe some expressions that are common just to a certain language, and they cannot be translated word by word or exactly in English. And this still works for languages that, as I said before, have a written form, but we have a lot of languages that don't have a standardized written form, that are mostly spoken, and their machine translation doesn't help very much at the moment. So this is where a lot of interesting work could still be done in terms of machine translation, language modeling, and all these technologies.
Well, I think if the news recommender system community were to hyper-focus on, let's say, accuracy, the classic metric of machine learning, they're probably optimizing in a good direction, but also to the wrong thing. That doesn't fully represent our goals. Do you think the goals of making news recommendation best for everyone, maybe you have some thoughts on what that even means, but can we express it in a loss function? Is it something algebraic, or is there something more to it?
I don't think we can represent everything that we want in one loss function, no. So, for example, in one of the works that I did, we were looking at how to mitigate this problem of filter bubbles, and how we can increase diversity, or even the opposite, how we can increase personalization with regards to certain aspects or attributes of the news. So we looked at the very standard categories, sentiments, and so on and so forth. But what we tried there is to create something modular where we can say, okay, we will always care about the relevance part. So whatever is recommended to me has to be relevant up to a certain degree, because otherwise I will just not care about that. But then, for example, if a user wants more diversity with regards to a category, but another one wants personalization with regards to viewpoints, how can we make that work sort of on the fly? And I think here the idea would be to have sort of a modular system where we can turn these knobs on the fly, such that we can really customize this to different users and to different preferences. And this brings me back to the idea before, how can we make sure that someone doesn't read, so that we don't overrepresent conspiracy theories and so on and so forth. This would be the idea, a system that we could use on a website or on a platform where we have some built-in controls that come from the editors or from other stakeholders, and then the user can, within certain limits, turn these knobs. So, for example, we also know that if you have too many options, users get confused. So let's say you have a default value for everything, and then you have elections and you care a lot about politics, then you want a lot more personalization, so a lot to see the same sort of news within the time span that are related to politics. But in another time period of your life, you would like, for example, a lot more categorical diversity to read about, um, traveling, music, sports, and so on and so forth. Um, and I think long term, this would also mean that we should create something like that that brings together different aspects that we care about. So not only the accuracy, but also the diversity, the language, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we can squish everything in one training loss or something like this.
We touched on NewsRecLib. It's an open source thing we can link to your GitHub page in the show notes. What's your vision for the future of the library? Who might consume it, and where do you hope it'll go in the future?
Yeah, so actually a big update to the library is quite overdue. So I'm hoping to focus a bit on this in the near future. So we already have a couple of data sets in there, but there's a couple more that are not already in the library that we should be adding, same as models. So for example, at the time that the library was released, we didn't have all these LLM-based recommendation. So that would be one side. Another very interesting thing would be to also include more approaches for diversification or other methodologies and models that are not yet there. So far, I think it's mostly used in academia, not that I know of industry using it, but generally, I think it would still be a very good place in the future for people to easily plug in their own model or take existing models and see how they compare against each other. So it already had quite a bit of adoption for, I would say, quite a niche domain. But in the future, it would be nice to see it grow more, and of course, have also a lot more input from other users and contributors.
Well, I'm curious if you have any recommendations for people interested in news recommendation who are earlier on in their career than you. They like the field, they want to get into it. It sounds like just becoming a heavy duty machine learning engineering person doesn't mean you can't contribute, but that's probably not the optimal path. What are the most promising areas for people to study?
Yeah, I mean, having some idea of machine learning is a very useful thing. I think not only looking at it from the machine learning perspective, but I think what helps a lot is coming at this problem from different angles. So I was lucky enough to not be only in a recommender system group. So I had a lot of exposure to natural language processing, which helped a lot on coming up with ideas on actually how to simplify news recommenders and how to better represent news. Also, of course, the very related information retrieval field. But going beyond that, I think a lot of interesting perspectives, especially if we talk about responsible AI, is also people with backgrounds in social sciences. And here I'm saying, media and communication, even psychology, law is very interesting. So how can we make all these systems comply with all these regulations nowadays? How do we satisfy all these different stakeholders? General, I think a lot of involvement also from the social sciences and humanities. So while knowing machine learning helps build the system, it's very interesting how we make the systems work, not just from the algorithmic point of view.
And what's next for you?
So, as I said in the beginning, I'm very interested in this responsible and inclusive AI for information access, and news recommendation was the beginning for me in my PhD, but I'm generally more interested in also other areas. So, for example, now I'm working on retrieval augmented generation, where we still have the classic retrieval side and the generation side. And here I also want to see, okay, what happens when we try to add diversity in the mix? So, for example, we ask a system a question, and what happens if it retrieves more diverse sources? Does it give us more diverse answer, or does it represent these sources equally? So I want to see how methods that have already been developed for information retrieval recommender systems can be reused or modified for these newer generative systems. So this would be one thing in this work. And another thing, sticking to the multilinguality part, as I've mentioned before, we have a lot of languages that are not standardized and don't have a written form. And maybe it's hard to work with some of these since they are not so easily reachable. But a very interesting case here in, especially in Europe, is that of linguistic variation in terms of dialects or different small regional changes in the language. And these are exactly mirroring these spoken languages because these forms of the language are mostly spoken and they don't have a standard variant. So, for example, if you ask a person from Bavaria to write down something from the dialect, him and his neighbor probably will have two differently written versions. And I think that looking at these sort of linguistic variations on a more fine-grained, smaller scale would help us develop technologies that would also be applicable to all these languages that are out there and that don't have a written form. And this would then hopefully in the long term bring us some technology that could help us also read or hear about events in from the native speakers where those events happen without using better machine translation or AI that helps us understand those languages.
Well, where can listeners follow you online?
Yeah, so I have my own webpage, just andreaiana.github.io. I generally post a couple of news about talks, papers that I've published, projects, and so on. For people interested in publications, there's always Google Scholar, just looking for my name. And I'm also sometimes a bit active on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. That's mostly it.
We'll have links in the show notes for listeners to follow up. Andreea, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thank you very much for having me and for the interesting discussion.
Definitely.